Welcome, brave listener. You're just in time for a special installment of Timeless Terrors. 3 tales gathered from the old Irish traditions, collected and retold in the 19th century by Lady Jane Wilde, mother to the famous Oscar Wilde, a household name. Perhaps you already know this, but Ireland, my stomping ground, is not a country that forgets its stories and its oral traditions. Guards them for the children of the future. Tonight you will hear of horned witches who walk in the dark, of brides taken by forces unseen, and of witches whose names were spoken only in fear. Now gather round and listen closely. The Horned Women, The Stolen Bride, and The Lady Witch. Compiled and collected by Lady Jane Wilde. Narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication 1887. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2026. Jonathan Dunne. A rich woman sat up late one night carding and preparing wool while all the family and servants were asleep. Suddenly a knock was given at the door and a voice called,
"Open! Open!"
"Who is there?" said the woman of the house.
"I am the witch of the one horn,"
was answered. The mistress, supposing that one of her neighbors had called and required assistance, opened the door, and a woman entered, having in her hand a pair of wool carders and bearing a horn on her forehead, as if growing there. She sat down by the fire in silence and began to card the wool with violent haste. Suddenly she paused and said aloud,
"Where are the women? They delay too long."
Then a second knock came to the door, and a voice called as before,
"Open! Open!"
The mistress felt herself constrained to rise and open to the call, and immediately a second witch entered, having 2 horns on her forehead and in her hand a wheel for spinning the wool.
"Give me place," she said. "I am the witch of the 2 horns."
And she began to spin as quick as lightning. And so the knocks went on, and the call was heard, and the witches entered, until at last 12 women sat round the fire, the first one with 1 horn, the last with 12 horns. And they carded the thread and turned their spinning wheels, and wound and wove, all singing together an ancient rhyme, but no word did they speak to the mistress of the house. Strange to hear and frightful to look upon were these 12 women, with their horns and their wheels, and the mistress felt near to death. And she tried to rise that she might call for help, but she could not move, nor could she utter a word or a cry, for the spell of the witches was upon her. Then one of them called to her in Irish, and said,
"Rise, woman, and make us a cake."
Then the mistress searched for a vessel to bring water from the well that she might mix the meal and make the cake, but she could find none. And they said to her,
"Take a sieve and bring water in it."
And she took the sieve and went to the well, but the water poured from it, and she could fetch none for the cake. And she sat down by the well and wept. Then a voice came by her and said,
"Take yellow clay and moss and bind them together and plaster the sieve so that it will hold."
This she did, and the sieve held the water for the cake. And the voice said again,
"Return, and when thou comest to the north angle of the house, cry aloud 3 times, and say, 'The mountain of the Fenian women, and the sky over it is all on fire.'"
And she did so. When the witches inside heard the call, a great and terrible cry broke from their lips, and they rushed forth with wild lamentations and shrieks, and fled away to Slieve na Mon, where was their chief abode. But the spirit of the well bade the mistress of the house to enter and prepare her home against the enchantments of the witches if they returned again. And first, to break their spells, she sprinkled the water in which she had washed her child's feet, the feet water, outside the door on the threshold. Secondly, she took the cake which the witches had made in her absence, of meal mixed with the blood drawn from the sleeping family. And she broke the cake in bits, and placed a bit in the mouth of each sleeper, and they were restored. And she took the cloth they had woven and placed it half in and half out of the chest with the padlock. And lastly, she secured the door with a great cross beam fastened in the jambs, so that they could not enter. And having done these things, she waited. Not long were the witches in coming back, and they raged and called for vengeance.
"Open! Open!"
they screamed.
"Open, feet water!"
"I cannot," said the feet water. "I am scattered on the ground, and my path is down to the loch."
"Open! Open, wood and tree and beam!"
they cried to the door. "I cannot," said the door, "for the beam is fixed in the jambs, and I have no power to move."
"Open! Open, cake that we have made and mingled with blood!"
they cried again. "I cannot," said the cake, "for I am broken and bruised, and my blood is on the lips of the sleeping children." Then the witches rushed through the air with great cries and fled back to Slievenamon, uttering strange curses on the spirit of the well, who had wished their ruin. But the woman and the house were left in peace. And a mantle, dropped by one of the witches in her flight, was kept hung up by the mistress as a sign of the night's awful contest. About the year 1670, there was a fine young fellow living at a place called Kerrin in the County Clare. He was brave and strong and rich, for he had his own land and his own house, and not one to lord it over him. He was called the Cairn of Kerrin, and many a time he would go out alone to shoot the wild fowl at night along the lonely strand, and sometimes cross over northward to the broad east strand, about 2 miles away, to find the wild geese. One cold, frosty November eve, he was watching for them, crouched down behind the ruins of an old hut, when a loud splashing noise attracted his attention. "It is the wild geese," he thought, and raising his gun waited in death-like silence the approach of his victim. But presently he saw a dark mass moving along the edge of the strand, and he knew there were no wild geese near him. So he watched and waited, till the black mass came closer. He distinctly perceived 4 stout men carrying a bier on their shoulders, on which lay a corpse covered with a white cloth. For a few moments they laid it down, apparently to rest themselves, and the cairn instantly fired, on which the 4 men ran away shrieking, and the corpse was left alone on the bier. Cairn of Kerrin immediately sprang to the place, and lifting the cloth from the face of the corpse, beheld by the freezing starlight the form of a beautiful young girl, apparently not dead but in a deep sleep. Gently he passed his hand over her face and raised her up, when she opened her eyes and looked around with wild wonder, but spake never a word, though he tried to soothe and encourage her. Then, thinking it was dangerous for them to remain in that place, he raised her from the bier, and taking her hand led her away to his own house. They arrived safely, but in silence, and for 12 months did she remain with the cairn, never tasting food or speaking word for all that time. When the next November Eve came round, he resolved to visit the East Strand again, and watch from the same place, in the hope of meeting with some adventure that might throw light on the history of the beautiful girl. His way lay beside the old ruined fort called Liushnefolinga, the Fort of the Mantle, and as he passed, the sound of music and mirth fell on his ear. He stopped to catch the words of the voices, and had not waited long when he heard a man say in a low whisper, "Where shall we go tonight to carry off a bride?" And a second voice answered,
Wherever we go, I hope better luck will be ours than we had this day 12 months.
"Yes," said a third. "On that night we carried off a rich prize, the fair daughter of O'Connor. But that clown, the Cairn of Kerrin, broke our spell and took her from us. Yet little pleasure has he had of his bride, for she has neither eaten nor drank nor uttered a word since she entered his house."
And so she will remain,
said a fourth,
until he makes her eat off her father's tablecloth, which covered her as she lay on the bier, and which is now thrown up over the top of her bed.
On hearing all this, the Cairn rushed home, and without waiting even for the morning, entered the young girl's room, took down the tablecloth, spread it on the table, laid meat and drink thereon, and led her to it, "Drink," he said, "that speech may come to you." And she drank and ate of the food, and then speech came. And she told the Cairn her story, how she was to have been married to a young lord of her own country, and the wedding guests had all assembled, when she felt herself suddenly ill, and swooned away, and never knew more of what had happened to her until the Cairn had passed his hand over her face, by which she recovered consciousness, but could neither eat nor speak, for a spell was on her, and she was helpless. Then the Cairn prepared a chariot and carried home the young girl to her father, who was like to die for joy when he beheld her. And the Cairn grew mightily in O'Connor's favour, so that at last he gave him his fair young daughter to wife, and the wedded pair lived together happily for many long years after, and no evil befell them, but good followed all the work of their hands. This story of Cairn of Kerrin still lingers in the faithful, vivid Irish memory, and is often told by the peasants of Clare when they gather round the fire on the awful festival of Samhain, or November Eve, when the dead walk, and the spirits of earth and air have power over mortals, whether for good or evil. About 100 years ago, there lived a woman in Joyce County, of whom all the neighbours were afraid, for she had always plenty of money, though no one knew how she came by it, and the best of eating and drinking went on at her house, chiefly at night, meat and fowls and Spanish wines in plenty for all comers. And when people asked how it all came, she laughed and said, "Oh, I've paid for it," but would tell them no more. So the word went through the county that she had sold herself to the evil one, and could have everything she wanted by merely wishing and willing. And because of her riches they called her the Lady Witch. She never went out but at night, and then always with a bridle and whip in her hand, and the sound of a horse gallop was heard often far on in the night along the roads near her house. Then a strange story was whispered about, that if a young man drank of her Spanish wines at supper and afterwards fell asleep, she would throw the bridle over him and change him to a horse, and ride him all over the country, and whatever she touched with her whip became hers. Fowls or butter or wine or the new-made cakes, she had but to wish and will, and they were carried by spirit hands to her house and laid in her larder. Then when the ride was done, And when she had gathered enough through the county of all she wanted, she took the bridle off the young man, and he came back to his own shape and fell asleep. And when he awoke, he had no knowledge of all that had happened. And the lady witch bade him come again and drink of her Spanish wines as often as it pleased him. Now, there was a fine brave young fellow in the neighbourhood, and he determined to make out the truth of the story. So he often went back and forwards and made friends with the lady witch, and sat down to talk to her, but always on the watch. And she took a great fancy to him, and told him he must come to supper some night, and she would give him the best of everything, and he must taste her Spanish wine. So she named the night, and he went gladly, for he was filled with curiosity. And when he arrived, there was a beautiful supper laid, and plenty of wine to drink. And he ate and drank, but was cautious about the wine, and spilled it on the ground from his glass when her head was turned away. Then he pretended to be very sleepy, and she said, "My son, you are weary. Lie down there on the bench and sleep, for the night is far spent, and you are far from your home." So he lay down as if he were quite dead with sleep, and closed his eyes, but watched her all the time. And she came over in a little while and looked at him steadily, but he never stirred, only breathed the more heavily. Then she went softly and took the bridle from the wall, and stole over to fling it over his head. But he started up, and seizing the bridle threw it over the woman, who was immediately changed into a spanking grey mare. He led her out and jumped on her back, and rode away as fast as the wind till he came to the forge. "Ho, smith!" he cried. "Rise up and shoe my mare, for she is weary after the journey." And the smith got up and did his work as he was bid, well and strong. Then the young man mounted again, and rode back like the wind to the house of the witch, and there he took off the bridle, and she immediately regained her own form, and sank down in a deep sleep. But as the shoes had been put on at the forge without saying the proper form of words, they remained on her hands and feet, and no power on earth could remove them. So she never rose from her bed again, and died not long after of grief and shame. And not one in the whole country would follow the coffin of the lady witch to the grave. And the bridle was burnt with fire, and of all her riches nothing was left but a handful of ashes. And this was flung to the 4 points of earth and the 4 winds of heaven. So the enchantment was broken, and the power of the evil one ended. And so, my dear friends, we have come to the end of our presentation for tonight, our 3-in-1, as it were. Lady Jane Wilde preserved these tales, and we can thank her that we are listening to them tonight. Never underestimate the power of oral tradition. Telling stories is a very human thing to do. We have been telling stories since the time we were in caves, right up to now. Until next time, brave listener. And remember, if someone knocks on your back door at 3 o'clock in the morning, think carefully before you answer it. Good night. This has been The Horned Women, The Stolen Bride, and The Lady Witch. Compiled and collected by Lady Jane Wilde. Narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication 1887. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2026. Jonathan Dunne.